Next, let us now proceed on to our last panel discussion. Can I have the seating ready, please? So this panel discussion is on the topic of future of supply chain for Indian Diagnostics Center. To invite on stage, I request Mr. Sudeep Das, who is the product procurement head of Metropolis Healthcare, to please come up on stage. Next, I invite Mr. Rajesh Patel, who is the Executive Director of IVD Business of MyLab Discovery Solutions, to please join us. Next, I invite Mr. Nikunj Mange, who is the owner of Aspira Path Lab and Diagnostics Center. I invite Mr. Rupesh Dagar, who is the business head of Shadri Specialty Labs. I also invite Mr. Prasad Nikam, who is the product head of supply chain of Crilio Health, to join us. For joining us virtually for this session, we have the renowned Principal Advisor of Spice Health and founder of Dr. DRG Labs, Dr. Ravi Gaur, with us. Welcome. Welcome, sir. Mr. Prasad Nikam would be leading this session, so I hand it over to you.
Hello. Thank you for inviting on the stage, and I welcome all the guests for the panel discussion. Um, we discuss a lot of topics today, point of care, genomics, IT, and all this. But the one thing that is common across these things is that it's a business, right? You have to run a business. We are running a business, aren't we? So there are two things that matters about business is top line and the bottom line. One thing is that you have to manage revenue and you have to minimize the cost. So when you think about these two things, and especially in healthcare, if you see that not a lot of focus is given on the cost optimization because it's like an evergreen business. It never stops. There is no recession for the healthcare business. But as we saw in last discussion with multiple panels, that there is a price pressure on the industry, in the industry, diagnostic industry. And when you have a pressure on the top line, then the best way to maximize the margins is through optimizing the cost of the business. The major contribution when it comes to cost is the operations and supply chain part, and it's mostly ignored. If you see any other industry, retail industry or any other industry, if you see it, they optimize it to the extreme levels, right? So take an example of auto business, for example, say they have just in a stock methodology where Toyota and all those companies run their inventories and stocks in 7 days, and they have took it to another level. But I think diagnostic industry especially is not there yet, and I think considering the pressure on the top line, we need to focus on the optimization of the cost, and I think focusing on supply chain operations and optimizing is the key to deliver that. By nature, supply chain management is complex because let's say you have one lab, then it's pretty straightforward. You add one more lab, you have 3 labs, you have 5 labs, you have 10 labs, you have 20 labs. And now it gets difficult because there is a lot of scope to optimize, right? So by nature, it's a complex process, but with iterative process, you can optimize it. So before we start discussion on what is like future of supply chain and what we're going to do, the basic understanding of supply chain, I would say, is that it's supply chain management is a process of integrating vendors, manufacturer, warehouses, multiple stores, so that inventories are distributed in the right quantities at the right time at the right place, while maintaining the satisfying level of services. Now, this sounds very cliche statement because right quantity at the right time at the right place. These are very simple statements to say, but it's extremely difficult to achieve that. So today we are going to have discussion. I don't think that is much of a discussion happens in healthcare industry, especially because it happens on genomics and AI and ML. But when it comes to cost optimization and business, healthcare, they talk about patient engagement and etc. But when it comes to about business, ultimately when business, so that doesn't happen that much. So I think this session would be really interesting because we'll be talking about what is the current state of supply chain in diagnostic industry and what's the future of it. So uh, I would start with Mr. Nikunj. You are heading the Aspera Lab and it's a public company. So especially in your case, there's a lot of pressure on the top line and bottom line. You always have to make plans and all the decisions that you make have to at least turn out in short term or in long term. So I would like to help understand that what are the decisions that you have made in past few years of being a public company that has contributed in transformative outcomes at the Aspera, especially in supply chain domain?
Thank you, Prasad. I think it's a great question, especially nowadays. I think before the panel discussion happened, just before this, there were so many interesting points. Like Rajesh said, price is not the only thing which will matter. So now what I am seeing personally is there are different business models are coming up. As you see there are labs like PharmEasy, Redcliffe, and there are SRL, Metro. They have the huge network. They are doing more than 3,000 test menu. So nowadays, knowing your business model is more important. And based on that business model, you have to design your supply chain or your inventory or in what area. You always need to find that sweet spot. Once you find that business model, based on that, I think we need to decide what would be your inventory or your supply chain method. For us, when I talk about Aspira, we are a pretty young lab, still a Bombay-based lab, and we want to expand. We want to focus now in Bombay or western part of Maharashtra. But even for us, we deal in HLM. We have collection centers. There are other franchise, and some of them where we keep flibos. So for all places, there is a different way we have to manage our inventory. And one thing COVID taught us a lot. I remember there was a time when government decided all the industries, they have to do mandatory RT-PCR. There was a time where VTM shortages were there. And during that time, having the kitna stock hai, how many VTMs we have, how many COVID PCR, when we are committing something to client and their company or their 1,000 workers depend on us, जब हम report देंगे, then only they can start working. And so during that time, we realized how important this part is. And during that process, we also realized managing HLM, managing collection center is way different than managing these kind of clients where huge demand suddenly comes to you. So I think everything is related to the business model. One example I just wanted to give, especially because you mentioned about the auto sector and Toyota. I was just reading a book where I think in Second World War, Toyota is from Japan, so they had their first company there, and it's never stable. Always earthquakes are there. It's one country where you see in every 2 years they are in news for some kind of a reason because of a natural disaster. And I remember there was a point where at that time, during World War II, they were producing around 11,000 cars. Compared to that, Ford was producing million plus cars. I would say nowadays we can compare with any new diagnostic industry compared to that. And what helped them? They found that business model and then they saw what Ford is doing and how we can change that. So I think their engineers, they visited their center and then they changed the whole supply game, as you said. And even nowadays it's being followed. I agree with the help of technology and a lot of things, they modified it a lot, but that was the base where first people were predicting कि हमें पूरे साल का FER targeting, let's say 100 CR as a turnover, let's give some commitment to vendor for this much amount. And sometimes vendor is also really important. I will come to later. But based on that, they were overcommitting. I would say certain time they would be overcommitting. They were giving false commitment. The capital which should be used for expansion or hiring a good manpower, or that would be used for somewhere else, or based on a demand. Let's say now monsoon is coming, so we need to order certain kind of a kit or any. I just want to give some example, and there was a stock which is a capital which can be used somewhere else. So instead of that predict, they were using some other model. So I think based on a business model and based on a live insight, if we can give a commitment to vendors and if we can manage inventory proper way, also with the help of digitization based on your model, if you can set certain parameters, let's say for HLM, certain number of stock, if you go below that, there should be certain notification should be coming. Because when you are a person driven or when your decision is based on certain person, there are a chances out of 100 times, 1 or 2 times he's going to make mistake, but we cannot afford, because how we play with, we are in that industry where people life or the tat or a lot of things depends on that. If kit or that consumable is not there, that test cannot perform in a certain time period. So that's why these kind of a thing, having digitization and setting a parameter for different kind of a business model can help. And that's it. I think that's why supply chain digitizing that part is so important in this.
I think that's an interesting point that you mentioned, that the business model defines what strategy you want to have for optimizing the supply chain. And I think it seems that there is no right answer for that question, but one answer for that question. But I think if you can identify your business model properly, then you can design your all supply chain in such a way that it can get optimized as much as possible. You also mentioned a point about specifically about vendors, and again, this is something not very much talked about because you have specific vendors for specific products for specific brands, and you need to, if you want to give quality, right? So in last discussion, the panel talked about the quality, etc. But if your raw material, which is the stock that you're using, is not of high quality, no matter what device you use, not what automation you use, you are going to get wrong results. So my next question is to Mr. Sudeep. There are different areas of supply chain management, sourcing, evaluation of contracts, contract monitoring, suppliers review, vendors reviews. So which are these areas in this aspect that you think needs a lot of significant improvement, and you think in future that going to change and needs a drastic change in order to make it really efficient?
Thank you for that. I generally feel that contract monitoring is one piece that needs a lot of improvement when it comes to how everything, especially supply chain, is governed. Because what we have seen generally is that there are a lot of contracts that are being made very loosely, and a lot of gray areas are missed out in that. So when actually an issue comes up with any lab or with any instrument, neither the supplier is very clear on exactly what needs to be done, or the lab is clear on what their role is. So I'll just give an example where, let's say if there is an instrument breakdown that happens, I mean, what are the terms of services that we have mentioned? Are we following that? I mean, is the company making sure that whatever has been mentioned in the contract, is it been properly followed? Who's governing that? Second is, we'll talk about the prices. Uh, a lot of contracts has a price benefits where up to a certain limit you get some freebies from the companies. Is there a mechanism where you can track it online, or can you do you have an AI tool which actually monitors it? So a person doing it, yeah, it becomes a lot of person dependent currently, which may or may not give the optimum result to the lab, and because of which your the prices of the kits and consumables that goes up. So yeah, that's one piece. I feel that contract monitoring is one thing that needs a lot of improvement, especially with something like a contract management software, CMS, where everything is governed online and it's not a person dependent. Uh, Supply chain team need not go into the detail of it every time and based on Excel or anything that they have to follow. But the system gives you exactly what needs to be done. and if that has been followed.
And in terms of evaluation of vendor, right? So this part of contract monitoring comes when you evaluated the vendor. But especially evaluating vendor itself is difficult because we have heard that there are a lot, especially in COVID time, there are a lot of products in market which were of not high quality, and it's difficult to judge that. So when it comes to evaluating vendors, where do you think that changes would require, and if we make those changes in terms of process evaluation, then it would give us really quality products.
See, especially during COVID times, what we saw is that there are a lot of traders in the markets who came up just because of certain products where the demand went up significantly. For example, your VTMs or your gloves or masks, it went up significantly. And there are a lot of unorganized players who came into the market just to make profit out of it. Now, a challenge for a supply chain team member is to make sure that although we are getting all the quantities at the right time to the lab so that the labs are able to perform the test on a timely basis, but also we are not giving them substandard quality material. So there has to be a balance maintained between that, and this is where a supply chain team member's role becomes very important, where he has to make sure that the vendors that they are dealing with are having the kind of reputation or that's like I would say MyLab is one of the companies which came up with a COVID test at a very early stage. Now MyLab has a certain reputation in the market, so it becomes very important for the labs or the supply chain team members not only to make sure that the vendors that they are selecting have a certain degree of reputation in the market where they are present for a certain number of years, but also the quality of material that is coming into the lab is tested by the lab and just not because of the pricing it is given to the lab. So that's something that needs a lot of thinking, and the supply chain team member along with the lab can should make sure that the evaluation of the vendors are done properly.
I think I'll come to Mr. Rajesh, and you must be having a different perspective because all other panelists are from the diagnostic business, but you are the vendor or manufacturer for that business. Now, you have a 30 years of experience in healthcare domain and recently have joined MyLab, spearheading their in vitro diagnostics business. So it is like a blank slate. We have to start from the beginning. And there are a lot of market changes that are also happening. As last discussion we had, point of care, and retail products for home testing. So how do you see that? How you're planning to implement the processes coming in the blank slate, like you have a new start? So based on your past experiences, how you're seeing the process implementation, and what changes do you see in future happening when it comes to supply chain?
Yeah, thank you. In last 3 decades, I witnessed a see-through change in the overall supply chain. Earlier, the diagnostic testing, whether it is a service or whether it is a product or a solution providing product. Earlier, the patient used to search for the diagnostic lab and they used to go for the diagnostic testing. Now the trend is reverse. Now the diagnostic lab is reaching to the patient. Now a phlebotomist can reach early morning at 6 o'clock at home for collecting the fasting samples, and on email the report can be collected. So when the industry has taken this turnaround change, when it became not a fee dependent service, but when it became a value dependent service, when it really has started giving the patient delight, the diagnostic service providers, that is the lab like Metropolis, like SRL, they have created over a period of time the challenges for the diagnostic solution providing company like MyLab. And as in the last panel discussion also, it is said that the trend is moved that the patient should be at the best ease. The patient as such is a sufferer. He's a suffering. He's dealing with a disease. So he's already having so many things to deal with. And if a company has to grow or if the service provider has to grow, they have to reach and delight the patient. And that changes has happened. See, 30 years back also, 70% of India was village. Today also 70% of India is village, but the definition of village is changed. Earlier in village, the diagnostic service was not available. Today in village, a satellite lab of all the big chain labs are available. Today you go to Kanpur, you will have all the chain labs laboratory available. Earlier, the Kanpur patient used to go to Lucknow for getting the HbA1c done 30 years back. So a lot of changes have happened in last 3 decades, and it was required. And a lot of digital tools have come, which has helped the diagnostic companies. Like today, supply chain management or supply chain is not only the product has to be made available at the site, but right from the demand planning, right from the fixing the right vendor who would be providing this particular material. And specifically when a company is a manufacturing company, the challenges are more because for a service providing lab, it may look like maybe RT-PCR kit. But for a manufacturer, that RT-PCR kit has maybe more than 200 components, which can come from maybe 50 different vendors. So what kind of quantity, and all these vendors, they have different lead times, different credit terms, different payment terms. So it also has an associated cash flow management. So right from finance till logistic till distribution, everything in jumble becomes the supply chain. And I have personally seen a lot of changes. Now, like for company like MyLab, as you said, that what kind of tools or what kind of future I am seeing for the organization. See, when my company like MyLab, which has emerged, the company had 2 choices: either to become one more diagnostic company or to become a company with a difference. I think MyLab has chosen the second. That we want to be in the industry. We want to provide all the tests which are required by the service providers like chain labs or standalone labs or government lab or hospital-based lab. But we want to really bring in all those products in on a different platform, which can really take less of time, less of trouble to the test performers also, and the best of the logistic or best of the supply chain can be provided. Thank you.
I think that's an interesting perspective, and as you mentioned that the change in industry, and earlier the patient used to search for the lab. Now lab has to search for the patient, and they have to not only search but they have to spend money to search the patient, which also again adds to the cost of the business. My next question would be to Mr. Rupesh. You have a really good, interesting experience when it comes to expansion. I think before this event, when we had discussion, I could hear 3-4 times you mentioning that expansion, that's your forte. But in COVID times, it was a very different time because expansions and all the spending and capex was on the pause. And so how did you change your perspective? How did you change the plan? Because you must be having 2-3 years, 4 years plan in front of you in terms of how you're going to expand. But in COVID time, if you can give some examples of how did you manage the business? Because the first rule of business is business continuity. If business stops, then everything stops. It has to be continuous. You cannot stop the business. So if you can give few examples in terms of COVID time, how did you manage all these multiple locations, multiple stores, multiple B2B partners, and how was your experience? And from those learnings, which would have been, I think, completely different in terms of what you have seen earlier. What are the insights that you got, and how you are taking those insights for the future expansion or future plans while expanding the diagnostic business?
Okay, I think that is multiple questions you asked me. Let me put it one by one. I think before I answer your questions, I would just like to thank. In fact, I would like to congratulate the Association of Voice of Healthcare for organizing this, because the COVID has actually kept us away. We have been meeting only virtually. But now I think it's good to meet face to face. So a big thank you to the organizing committee for organizing this. Coming to your questions, I think there are 2 things to it. One is in COVID pandemic and the economic downturn which was happened has actually taught us in the way the supply chain management is to function will not be sufficient. The reason why I say this is because the supply chain management system now has to balance between the, the efficiency with adaptability, flexibility, and effectiveness. Second, what we are all looking at COVID, but there is one more thing which is happening in the industry, which I would like to mention here is uh, the competitiveness in the diagnostic industry is increasing. I mean, if you see, the primary market capital infusion, which is happening now in form of private equities, and IPOs, that is changing the industry of diagnostic. The industry has already witnessed the three big major M&As, Theracare, Suburban, and High Tech, which are the biggest three M&As. A lot of regional players are actually raising funds. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning here is this is because if you see the entire diagnostic industry, 46% is basically a standalone laboratories in the country. Approximate 6 to 7% are pan-India players. 11% are regional chain, and balance 36% are hospital-based lab. So in the way the supply chain management functions, in the standalone lab or in the regional or in the lab which are running locally, it been more run, and monitored by the entrepreneur or the pathologist who is actually running the business. But going forward, when the percentage of organization, organized industry will increase, we all know the fact that the industry is a lot of, almost 60-70% industry is unorganized. So the way the supply chain functions will change completely. Now, this shift which is happening in the industry, COVID is already there. COVID has taught us, how the business has to be now, run. It is changed, but this progress in the industry, with these changes which is happening, which will take supply chain management to a different level. So it will be, I saw one of the panelists, Dr. Arora said, okay, the devil lies in the data. So supply chain management will be more data driven now. Just not be, procurement or, maintaining inventory. It will not be that game. Now, coming back to your question, what happened in lockdown. So in lockdown, I think everybody were running home, when the lockdown was announced. I think for the healthcare workers, we were actually marching in a different direction. In fact, we feel ourselves lucky also, we contributed to the society. So what problem basic we felt as a company was people like phlebotomists, technicians, there were a lot of fear in their mind. I mean, there were not clarity, what will happen, how what is the safety precaution need to be taken. So that actually was a hindrance in business continuity. And business continuity is one thing which was already there in our mind, how we can run the business in spite of the lockdown. So what we did first was we started training them. Training was the most crucial thing which we thought we did first thing. At every level, whether it is phlebotomists, technicians, or or all the riders who are bringing samples, in the way sample has to be transported. So all those things we started working on that, and that actually helped us. That gave confidence to a lot of the team, and they started working. Second thing is a lot of things were happening manually. So if you see, sample extraction was done manually in the lab, which used to take a lot of time. Lab can only perform maybe 150 or 200 samples a day. How to increase the capability of the lab? So there the supply chain management comes in, and with the help of all the stakeholders, immediately we placed an order of extraction machine, and our capability increases from 200 to 2,000 samples a day. So that's how, in a situation where things changes, when things hit you, with a lot of government regulations, forcing you to keep on changing, I think, in fact, the supply chain management, I must mention here, they have done an excellent job. They were completely on their toes only the entire COVID period. I mean, maintaining BTM and, maintaining those PP kits, masks, there was a lot of chaos everywhere. I think those guys have done very well. I think I must, congratulate to Mr. Sudeep and who was handling this particular department in that. So overall, if you see, I think in the age where we are more dominated by technology, I think the supply chain professionals have a great future. I must mention that. Uh, so that's how I feel. These two things. One is definitely the COVID had taught us learning, and the second thing was the industry which is changing, and will create a big impact on the way the department is functioning. Sample transport, the sample transport from B2B and various touch points. What has happened is before COVID, the logistic was more predictable. Like from one location to second location to third location, sample has to be there was a relay where sample will come through bus or will come through train. But COVID has actually changed that because of the lockdown. This predictability was finished. Now what required was end-to-end solution. Like the end-to-end where the company only manages the pickup samples from a particular locations, bring it back to the lab and report it. So this involves a lot of technology upgradation, which also happens in this COVID period. So I look at it this way: going forward, the entire supply chain management functions will be a different ball game, and it will be more data driven and it will be more innovative.
I think that is quite true that it is going to be data driven, and it's very evident when you see any other industry, especially Amazons and Flipkarts. You see they are very obsessive about data, and you can see the results in terms of how they are able to scale and what results they're able to get. So I think there will not be any disagreement in terms of whether it's going to be data driven or not. But you mentioned the point that sample management, right? Supply chain is not only about inventory and etc. It's also about sample management, and especially in diagnostic business, how you run the samples, in what group, at what device, in which brand, all those things matter. So my next question will be to Dr. Ravi Gaur, and in diagnostic supply chain, not only involves inventory and reagents as I mentioned, it is a sample management also. And in order to maximize the efficiency of individual labs efficiency and minimize the cost of operation, you have to process the samples in such a way that the outcome can be achieved. It seems very easy problem, optimization problems it seems easy, but it requires multiple variables and optimization at multiple variables. So we would like to understand from Dr. Ravi Gaur is that how do you manage that currently in terms of samples, and what changes do you see in future that needs to be done so that this can be optimized to the level where significant cost savings can be done?
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Prasad, for having me in the panel. I mean, I'm here virtually. I wish I wanted to be there in physical things, so meet all of you in person, but somehow I was not able to travel. So I think, firstly, this is a very good question because I think, and I really, like to thank the organization, Voice of Healthcare, who are actually totally focused. I mean, very important question, supply chain and logistics, which has been now discussed, which was really not happening probably 3-4 years back when COVID was really not there. So that's probably one of the learnings, and probably we are talking from the COVID point of view. Secondly, I'd like to probably do another thing before I answer your question. When Nikunj said, I think we're talking about he read something in the World War and he learned something from there. I think that's something which is like, okay, I mean, we are now pathology testing, pathology processes. We are probably, it's like a war, definitely to be very frank. If you have a chain of lab, you will realize it's like a nightmare. And you have to respond in a deadline. If you don't deadline, your sample is dead. And that sample is dead means the patient is no more there, missing a deadline, missing a report is the missing thing. So I think this is a very, very important focus. And lastly, I likely congratulate the supply chain thought process providers or head of the departments or the procurement guys. They really not today they are in focus, back in focus, especially from the bottom line point of view, not all, because they are the one. That's the major focus. Second is something they because if they really want to succeed, those in supply chain should know that impossible has to be made possible. That's what it is, because they have to deliver. And that is something which is probably supply chain has that much importance today. Now, coming to your question, what happened? Because not only it's the reagents, the devices, it's the consumables. That's one important integral part. Without that, of course, without tools, we are of no use in the labs. But the sample is the most important part. You may be all ready, but where is the sample? So starting from what Rajesh said, like era of the point of care, I think I'll go a step further on that thing. Today we have wearable devices. We have, continuous monitoring devices which need to be monitored. What are they giving other quality or whatever the alerts are? Because they are the first point of contact for a patient now. They're wearing on the wristband and they get alert. So that is from there. Then from the point of care testing, you can say home care, from the patient, like somebody goes and collects a sample. From there, sample comes to collection centers, franchisee centers, or our regional reference labs, or you can say a reference lab, and from their reference lab, it may be going to clinical trial or it could be sent abroad international testing. I think the sample journey itself is a big logistic, and supply chain. Because without the supply of sample, the right time, right place, I think the whole system will not work. That's what we are here for. And so I think the two important part, I think, what is happening is the changes what I see, because if you look at any of the labs, there's a component called a pre-analytical, analytical, and post-analytical. I think we'll probably focus here on the pre-analytical part here, because the moment you in any of the good quality labs, which is even I think majority of the bigger labs are not focusing on quality, because without quality you will not survive in any case long term. There is something called sample rejection. What is a sample rejection? Because there is almost like 2, 3, 4% samples get rejected, especially when you have to high-end labs. Now, this is a dead loss, because if you cannot transport a sample in time, you have sample as all efforts become zero. Patient is not going to pay you again. You have to do the whole exercise again, and you may need 50% time the patient is lost, revenue is lost. I think if you can even bring down this rejection rate by 1, 1.5, or say by even 10%, straight away that goes to your bottom line, and that's a profitability. So for that, I think the very important role today we have is the information technology or the lab softwares, which is right from barcoding, and barcoding, sample tracking, sample, and because multiple types of sample, not what you've seen in RT-PCR become a norm now. Many of the people are asking about RT-PCR. RT-PCR, they're asking even RT-PCR or any other thing. You have an RT-PCR? You have an RT-PCR for this, not only for COVID. They're now asking that because they're aware of that. So it's a very temperature sensitive kind of a thing. So getting the template at the right temperature, data loggers, color changing strips, and right, arriving at the lab, measuring the temperature. I think this all has to be recorded and you can actually track it down. And this is where I think the technology is going to play a very, very important role. And if you can do that, it's going to be helping in operations, increasing our revenue, better turnaround time, and of course, automatically a better bottom lines out there, because volumes are there in any case, but you have to know how to, optimize and make use of it. Second important part, I think if you have a proper data analytical system, now what is going to be do that? How do you manage the, inventory based on the sample flow? Because they may be like I've seen that areas maybe somewhere this epidemic of dengue is on, somewhere chikungunya is on, somewhere normal flu is on. Some labs, if you look at the lab clientage of the patient, like Ravi said, I think Nikunj also was mentioning, we have hospital-based labs, they have independent labs, they have small satellites owned lab. So the lab nature can change. Some labs are probably more of preventive health checkup labs. Some labs are ICU, or maybe the hospital has more of a nephrology unit is more stronger. Some hospital has oncology is more stronger. So you need to maintain your stock and reagents accordingly. You cannot default on that. But if you stock an HbA1c in a cancer center, it may not be of much of use. But there you require CA153, CA125. That whole data is going to come from your software. So I think what I'm trying to say is identify your need, identify a hotspot, especially based on the type of sample you're testing. This is what I think something, if you have a analytical space sample comes to you, you create an algorithm and you stock your reagents accordingly wherever they are. And this is an integration which is very, very important today, and which is, I think, for the optimization or better function of the lab, this is another area which we need to work into. Now, of course, everybody is doing barcoding. Barcoding of the samples, of course, tracking of samples already happening. Accordingly, you probably can, shift the inventory from here to here, because you may not bring the samples all the way, because you may probably create, okay, I want to have a more, my clientage is more specific, and those clientage are coming into, say, I probably do more of a cardiac test or more of a gastro test in that zone and this zone. So accordingly, I siphon my inventory. So I think both the things have to be very well correlated, and that only, nothing else, probably human mind cannot. I think you have to put an analytical system, lab management system, or a software system, whatever you can say, the inventory system, and put it together. And this is where the issues are. Now, I think Rajesh also mentioned to, like big labs have created challenges to the solution provider. And of course, I think it's fun. Better the challenge, we are more challenged, I think, So challenge upon challenge, that's a wonderful thing because I think this is how you have to, if there's no challenge, we not innovate. So innovation and renewal are required to keep labs in the frontier of science. Now, based on what is customer requirement, sample requirement, type of sample requirement, how do you transport this sample? How do you what is the kind of clientage you have, what are the type of tests you're doing, can you bring the sample, one sample is divided into three parts, one part goes here, second part goes here, third part goes there in the lab chain because that test is not performed. How do you make sure that everything is, because otherwise it gets sample had to be diluted, it might get degenerate, you have to transport, the logistic cost, report is not in time, again a loss to you. So I think this is a very important analytical assessment of samples, how to divert, what to do, and how do you equip your lab based on the type of lab. That's going to be a major change, and which I think more labs are already doing. And lastly, I think we just heard just talking about, in COVID, a lot of courier companies were picking samples. Now I think labs are trying to make their own guides, home collection guides, phlebotomy guides, outsourcing guides. But I really don't know. Probably there is an opportunity right here because very difficult because this is a many manpower extensive kind of a thing. So maybe we're going to see here a future. There'll be pure logistic. Actually, they know you probably alerted this sample to be picked up from this place to that place, and this the type of based on the type of sample. Maybe a new model going to come up, and this is there have been some. I think you've seen some companies are doing that. They did a lot of good work during the COVID. But future, I think, is right up here. And so the type of sample, what again I repeat, the type of sample, the kind of client workload you have, I think these are the two going to be defining the entire logistic chain and integration with the IT lab management software is mandatory, I think, for survival. Otherwise, you're not going to survive and they're going to be tough for each and everybody. That's what is going to be nutshell I want to share about it.
Thank you, Dr. Gaur. I think the point you mentioned is that currently I also talk to multiple customers that we have in diagnostic industry. And I've seen that they stop at the stage of recording. So they record all the data and they stop there and they have all the data. But the question again remains is like, are you using any analytical tools to get any insights from it and you to make decisions out of it, right? So I think that's an important point. Now going back to Mr. Nikunj, I think if you ask any business owner, would you like to expand? And no business owner will ever say that I don't want to expand. And expansion of business, not only in diagnostic, but any other industry is a difficult task. And I would like to understand from Mr. Nikunj, when you open a new lab or you expand the business, right, it involves multiple activities, right? And when you're opening new labs, you have to make sure that the current processes that are happening in existing labs are working properly. And at the same time, when expansion is happening, those things are going as per the plan. So if you can just give a little bit understanding of like what are the major challenges that you face when expanding the business, especially when it comes to supply chain and inventory management domain.
I think it's a great question. And nowadays, if you want to survive, I think you need to have the volume, especially the pathology has become a capacity utilization game. As much as sample you process, your cost comes down, you can have a really good relation with a vendor, you can negotiate. So it's always good to have a vendor who can make you competitive in a market because even though we say it's not a just price competitive market or there is still we have 120 crore population, there's still a huge demand, but we have to agree a city like Bombay or even surrounded area, it is a huge competition. We never know which way this industry will go. People are saying low price, I mean, that they will not survive for long or they will, but you have to be ready with best of your price. At this point, if you have a good margin, you can survive for longer. So for us, whenever we open a new lab, we always make sure we have a client base there where it will help us to, before, I think someone was saying, I forgot the name, they were saying people try to cut the prices because kahan pe unko profit chahiye. There they compromise on, I would say, where control calibration, they don't do that, or क्योंकि वहाँ का costing or that logistic or whatever area territory use है, it's loss making territory. So we make sure whenever we start a new lab or new location, we have certain client base there. The day we start something, we know the requirement, we get certain commitment from a doctor, only then we start. Because that thought should never even come कि हम लोग को we need to compromise on quality or anything. So these are this is first thing. Second, we have certain vendors where we have a past relation. We started a lab with Dr. Pankaj Shah, who is this in industry from past 35 years. So he trusts, it's a certain name companies are there who are well-known company in this. So we make sure the availability of vendor is there wherever we are starting a lab. We make sure the quality is being maintained by that. Whenever machine breakdowns or that kind of a service area he covers, and whatever he commits, I think one point you mentioned about was the contract. What till what time they will come back, and thirdly, there is enough market for that. So these are the major thing which we decide. Also, as I said, the business model and finding a sweet spot between standalone lab and big corporates, for us, it become really important, like where we want to target. I cannot say I want to just target all the specialized tests or I want to go into that. So we make sure the people we are targeting or the the doctors or hospital which we are targeting, we are able to maintain our margins. Whatever we are doing, we want to do it good. As I think one thing standalone lab do, they have a good communication with doctors. Any report, anything is there, they directly talk ke isme ye kya kar sakte hain or what needs to be done. I think we try to find somewhere where there is a point of contact who can talk to a doctor, and we make sure the quality or things are maintained using the software which we are using. Nowadays, I think everyone is talking about a quality, but we have to understand there are more than 1 lakh lab across India who are a standalone lab. They want to improve their quality. They want to give the quality service, but there should be someone who can help them. There are a lot of companies. One point which came up is about the data. Everyone wants to do data mining. Everyone wants to use their data in a certain way. But big MNCs still say, I think 85% of MNCs still says they are whatever data they have, they are not able to use it in a proper way. Because I think that was also one of your points.
Yes, so I think taking that point forward, I think the data point, right? So I would have two main questions. I would ask one question to analyst and two questions to other because we have a limited time. So my question to Mr. Sudeep would be, you do a lot of budget planning and procurement planning, etc. And as Nikunj mentioned that there's a lot of data, but analytical tools are limited. So there are a lot of talks happening in AI, machine learning, etc. when it comes to multiple areas of diagnostics. So when it comes to budget planning and procurement planning, do you see that happening? And if it's how it is, like if you can just briefly explain.
Definitely, it's going to help because see, for labs like Metropolis or SRL or Dr. Lal's, the major challenges that we as procurement team faces is that whenever there's a lab that comes up in remote locations like tier 2 or tier 3 cities, what happens is how do we make sure that the lab is having optimum amount of inventory where they do not have too much of wastages, but at the same time they don't run out of stocks when it is required, because patient samples coming in and the labs do not having materials is another challenge. Thirdly, they should not have excess of inventory. So how do you find a delicate balance between making sure that whatever the labs have are in the right amount of inventory? So as Nikunj also rightly said that labs like Metropolis, they don't
Mr. Rajesh Patel. To Mr. Sudeep Das. To Mr. Nikunj Mange. Next to Mr. Rupesh Dagar. I request Dr. Naveen Nishchal to please present the certificate of felicitation to Mr. Prasad Nikam. Thank you, everybody. You can please resume your seats. Thank you. Well, with that, we come to an end to this grand event. Every good thing has to end at some point.